The Earth is one giant ecosystem. Wind and ocean currents can carry material and organisms across the globe. Everything is connected in some way or another, except for the few places that aren't. And those places might prove that there's life on Mars. Isolated ecosystems are somewhat rare, but they do happen on islands or caves or other remote parts of the world. One of the most common examples of this is the Galapagos Islands. If you're unfamiliar, the Galapagos Islands are a group of volcanic islands in the eastern Pacific. They're pretty close to the equator and about 500 miles west of Ecuador. It was on these islands that Charles Darwin observed some finches that would eventually lead to him writing The Origin of Species, which is considered to be the foundation of evolutionary biology. One of the most important features of these islands is that they're almost completely isolated from the rest of the world. And because of this isolation, some very unique animals have evolved there that exist nowhere else in the world. Many of these animals are very unique in their physiology or behaviors. The list of endemic species is pretty big, so I won't go over all of it, but it includes some pretty cool animals such as the marine iguana, Galapagos penguins, the blue-footed booby, Galapagos fur seals, the Galapagos tortoise, and of course, Darwin's finches. You might have noticed that a lot of these are flyers or swimmers, and that's because the islands are volcanic islands, which means they were never connected to a major continent. So any land-based animals would have had a really hard time getting there. How did a tortoise end up there? Well, we're not really sure, but some scientists think that they might have floated over on a piece of wood or something like that. So based on what we can see from the Galapagos Islands, we know that if there is any life on Mars, it's been so isolated from Earth's ecosystem that it probably looks nothing like any of the life on Earth. Just like how much of the life on the Galapagos Islands evolved to be very unique and took a pretty different evolutionary path than most of the plants or animals that we're familiar with. But here's the problem. Mars doesn't have a magnetic field like Earth does. Earth's magnetic field repels radiation from the sun, but without a magnetic field, Mars's surface is constantly pelted by radiation. There are bacteria that have evolved to be radiation resistant, and if we kind of continue that line of thought, then it would be reasonable to assume that there are bacteria that are partially or completely immune to radiation damage. In addition to bacteria that's been found on a space station, we've also found bacteria on Earth that can resist doses of radiation that are thousands of times stronger than the lethal amount for humans. And if that's the case, then it would be reasonable to think that maybe there could be larger multicellular organisms that could be resistant to Mars's radiation. But let's slow down for a second. We're making quite a few big jumps here, and we don't really have any hard evidence that larger organisms would be able to scale up these DNA repairing techniques. But that might not actually be totally necessary for life on Mars. There are some places on Mars that aren't radioactive, like underground. Back on Earth, there is a cave that was discovered in 1986, called Movile Cave. The cave was discovered in Romania by a prospecting crew that was looking for a good spot for a geothermal power plant. The cave was cut off for the rest of the world for millions of years until the prospecting crew dug into it. And when they opened it up and went inside, they found a thriving ecosystem unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. The first organisms to inhabit the cave arrived around 5.5 million years ago, but the most recent additions look like they came in a little over 2 million years ago, so the cave has probably been in total isolation for only 2 million years or so, but that's still a really long time. If you've taken a basic biology class, you know that every ecosystem relies pretty heavily on primary producers. In most cases, that's plants that use the sun rays for photosynthesis to make food for themselves. Herbivores then eat these plants, carnivores eat the herbivores, various food chains connect to form a complicated food web that is all centered around the plants and photosynthesis. The problem here is that in a completely sealed off cave, there's no sunlight. So how can an ecosystem survive without any sun? Through a process called chemosynthesis. Much like photosynthesis, chemosynthesis is a way for organisms to make their own carbohydrates that they can use as food. The main difference here is that instead of using carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight, chemosynthetic organisms use hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide, and a little bit of oxygen to create water, sulfur, and carbohydrates. The organisms that can perform chemosynthesis are the primary producers in this kind of ecosystem. They're basically the grass. Then they get eaten and energy can circulate through other organisms and throughout the ecosystem. By the way, the top predator in Movile Cave is actually a centipede. I just thought that was kind of interesting. The whole process is called biogeochemical cycling, and this process could be potentially happening on Mars. Mars's radiation can only penetrate several meters down, so once you get deep enough, radiation protection isn't really a concern. The rocks can do it for you. Movile Cave and a few other caves like it have proven that ecosystems can thrive completely underground without any sunlight. So it could be reasonable to think that if there was life on Mars, then as the electromagnetic shell weakened, life would have had to flee underground into cave systems where the radiation couldn't reach them, and then they adapted in a similar way that the creatures of Movile Cave have. Now, one important thing about Movile Cave's ecosystem is that there's a lot of water. The water gives a place for some of the creatures to live in, as well as helps keep creatures alive and cycling nutrients. As far as we can tell, water is necessary to life. As you can see, it's present in both chemosynthesis and photosynthesis, and is a reagent, product, or solvent in almost every biological process. We still aren't totally sure if there's currently liquid water on Mars, but it's possible that there is some deep underground, and if there are water-filled caves, then an ecosystem like this could reasonably exist on Mars. But it seems like the most likely place for Mars to have water, and thus have the potential for life, is actually under its polar ice caps. Let's take a quick look at another isolated ecosystem on Earth: subglacial lakes in Antarctica. Underneath more than 2 miles of ice sits a freshwater lake called Lake Vostok. The ice applies so much pressure that it lowers the freezing point of water, so you end up with a super cold, high-pressure freshwater lake under miles of ice. Lake Vostok is named for the nearby Vostok Station and was discovered in 1993, though there was speculation that a lake like that could exist for decades before that. Once we found Lake Vostok, we started looking around and found that it is actually one of more than 700 subglacial lakes. Once the lake was discovered, people immediately wanted to study it, but they were met with quite a bit of opposition. Many environmentalists were worried that any attempt to gain samples would risk contaminating the lake, so only a very limited number of samples have been collected. One technique they used to limit potential contamination was to stop drilling just before they hit the water. Then they would pull the drill out, let the pressure differential push up water into the hole, let it freeze, and then take a sample of that frozen lake water. Other samples were taken of ice just before they got all the way down to the lake, but the amazing thing was that these samples had microbes in them. When they sequenced the DNA, they found evidence of a huge variety of single-celled organisms, as well as a few sequences from multicellular organisms. There were also sequences from a bacteria that is known to inhabit fish intestines, so there was pretty strong evidence of multicellular life down there. We won't know for sure until we can get a camera down there, but that has a high likelihood of contaminating the lake and potentially introducing something that would throw off the ecology of the lake, so we probably won't be doing that anytime soon. But the most exciting part of this is that it looks like there could be subglacial lakes like this on other planets or even moons. There's strong evidence that the polar ice caps on Mars also have subglacial lakes. And if there ever was life on Mars, then there are probably still thriving ecosystems under these ice caps. And yes, the ice layers are thick enough that it would protect against radiation. But Mars isn't the only celestial body with a lot of ice on it. Europa and Enceladus are moons of Jupiter and Saturn, respectively, and their surfaces are almost completely ice. Under those icy surfaces, it looks like there's a lot of liquid water, and I mean a lot of liquid water. One of the most popular theories right now is that both of these moons have a global subsurface ocean. So basically, the planet is made up of its core and mantle, much like Earth, but then these moons would have a liquid ocean and then an icy crust on top. The only thing about ice moons like this is that it seems like an unlikely place for life to occur. If microbes were able to get there and were well adapted to the environment already, it's likely that they could survive and eventually thrive. But as far as we can tell, the spontaneous formation of life wouldn't happen somewhere that cold. This is where the panspermia hypothesis comes in, though. The idea is basically that life can spread between planets. This can hypothetically happen when meteorites or asteroids break off of a planet due to some kind of impact or cosmic collision. And then those chunks can crash into another planet, bringing bacteria or other microorganisms with it. So if something like that happened, life could end up on a moon like Europa and Enceladus. There's solid evidence that Mars used to have Earth-like conditions. Not exactly like Earth, but it had an atmosphere, it had liquid water on the surface, and there was an electromagnetic shell. Some people have even speculated that life in the solar system could have started on Mars and then through panspermia moved to Earth. Life is thought to have originated on hydrothermal vents in the sea. The heat and chemicals there would have provided favorable conditions for the formation of life. And Mars at one point did have oceans and a molten core. So life in our solar system could have started on Mars and then traveled to Earth. Some of the most compelling evidence for life on Mars was just discovered: long-chain hydrocarbons. To put simply, these are basically fragments of the building blocks of life. Long-chain hydrocarbons can happen without life, but they require some pretty specific conditions. The Mars rover Curiosity does have an onboard lab, but Curiosity's lab doesn't really have the right tools to see if there are more complex molecules present or to determine if the origin of these hydrocarbons was from something living. But either way, this is a really big discovery that definitely hints that there might have been life there. I'm not saying that there definitely is life on Mars or other moons or planets, but from what we've seen in Earth's isolated ecosystems, it seems like life can adapt to some pretty weird environments and survive in ways that for a long time we didn't think was even possible. Personally, I think that it's possible and even likely that we find life in caves or under polar ice caps. If you want to learn more about microorganisms that are surviving in harsh environments, check out this video about bacteria that evolved to live on a space station. Anyway, that's all I have for you guys. I'll see you next time, and stay curious.